Welcome to today's episode of the Educational Duct Tape Podcast. Today, I'm joined by podcasting expert Chris Nesi. Chris is the host of 4 podcasts, editor of multiple podcasts, and founder of the Education Podcast Network. So yeah, he's pretty knowledgeable about podcasting. He's also a high school teacher and a university professor, so this episode is not to be missed. Let's get to it.
Hey y'all, I'm Casey Bell from the Shake Up Learning Show, a part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to now. Shows on the network are individually owned and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other interesting education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Welcome to the Educational Duct Tape Podcast with Jake Miller.
Hello, welcome in duct tapers. And of course, welcome to any newbies who have no idea what a duct taper is. Well, guess what? You are a duct taper now. Just by pressing play on this podcast, you are officially a duct taper. Actually, there's one last step before you become a full-fledged duct taper, the oath. Please repeat after me. I, state name, pledge that I will listen to this slightly silly podcast and attempt to smile and laugh despite how insanely difficult my job is. I also pledge to hear the EdTech ideas and tools mentioned within and to not let myself become overwhelmed by them, but instead to add them to the toolbox of resources that I consider using in my learning environment. I also pledge to send Jake a large bag of Reese Cups or peanut butter M&Ms. It was worth a try, right? Anyhow, enough of that. On the topic of pledging their allegiance to the Educational Duct Tape Podcast, I'd like to give a shout out to a dude who has been a huge help to the show and has certainly pledged his allegiance to it, Mr. Sean Fahey. Not only was Sean a phenomenal guest back in season 1, but he now edits most interviews for the show and prepares promotional graphics and videos for the show. You owe Sean a debt of gratitude because thanks to him, you don't have to hear me accidentally burp mid-interview or get in arguments with Soapy the Soapbox while talking to a guest. Thanks, Sean. Up next is the soapbox moment for this episode. For the newbies out there, that's the part of the show where I step up on my proverbial soapbox. Okay, real soapbox. Okay, living, breathing soapbox. Is that good enough? Seriously. Anyhow, it's the time when I share a message that has been on my mind about educational technology integration, or sometimes education in general. In the interest of keeping my sanity, which, as you know, I'm short on already, lately I've been rotating between preparing new soapbox moments and sharing old ones. Today, I'm going to share an old one, but it feels like new because it reminds me of what a lot of educators are going through in January of 2022. The exact parameters are a little different. Hello, Omicron, sub shortages, and confusing CDC guidelines, but the message is the same. Teachers are just like Michael Jordan. So let's time travel back to March 11th, 2021 to hear why. Oh, sorry. Hold on. Let me just grab my soapbox from over here. Yeah. There we go. That's perfect. Climb up on there. Michael Jordan had a swing that looked like Charles Barkley swatting at a mosquito with a 5-iron. This quote from Michael Bauman of The Ringer about Michael Jordan's attempt to play Major League Baseball highlights the common belief about the attempt. Jordan wasn't any good. But let's look at the full quote. Despite having a swing that looks like Charles Barkley swatting at a mosquito with a 5-iron, Jordan still went into Double-A cold and hit .202. By the time he got to the Arizona Fall League that year, he was starting to blend in and look more comfortable. So, was he a failure? Cleveland baseball manager Terry Francona, who was Jordan's Birmingham Barons coach, said in the Last Dance documentary, "I can't believe he actually hit .202. He drove in 50 runs. We had a lot of good prospects that didn't drive in 50 runs. In my opinion, with 1,500 at-bats, he would have found a way to get to the major leagues." When you compare it to what Jordan was doing the previous year, leading his team to their third consecutive NBA championship, his own third consecutive NBA Finals MVP award, falling just shy of a third straight NBA Most Valuable Player award, his ninth straight NBA All-Star Game appearance, his seventh straight All-NBA First Team honor, his sixth straight NBA All-Defensive First Team honor, his seventh straight year leading the league in scoring, his third time leading the league in steals, and, being one of the most recognizable and popular humans on the planet, when you compare that to his attempt at Major League Baseball, it's easy to see the baseball thing as a failure. But really, in a typical season, around 1,000 players are signed to Major League contracts, and only about 750 or so step onto the field in a Major League game. Minor leaguers like Jordan are at the bottom of that list of 1,000. So if he was the worst in the league, which he probably wasn't, that would make him roughly the 1,000th best baseball player in the world. That's pretty good, I think. Why am I talking about Michael Jordan anyhow? Because this reminds me of teachers. Seriously, hear me out. We haven't spent years dunking basketballs and shooting Nike commercials, but we have spent years honing our craft in our classrooms, just like Jordan did on the basketball court. And we're really good at it. But this year, we got assigned to a baseball team. Wait, what? Seriously, in my most recent episode, Joe Marquez and I talked about how difficult concurrent teaching is. Yesterday, I was helping prepare a group of teachers from the Sylvan Union School District for concurrent teaching. And it dawned on me. They are Michael Jordan after he first retired from basketball. We are Michael Jordan walking away from the game that we were the best in the world at, except not by choice. We were at the top of our face-to-face teaching game, but were forced by circumstances out of anyone's control to play a new game. Teacher of the Year honors, happy students, great standardized test scores, if we didn't care about those. But anyhow, we were rock stars. But now we've got to play baseball. And look at Jordan. He was pretty good right away. Batted .202. That means he got hits on 20% of his at-bats against pitchers who were among the 1,000 best players in baseball. He hit 50 RBIs. Think about it. He came into the league as a gifted athlete, fierce competitor, and motivated student of the game. And that was enough to put him in the top 1,000. And that's us. He wasn't as good at baseball as he was at basketball, but he was pretty good, and he should be proud. And you're probably not as good at concurrent teaching as you are at fully in-person teaching, but you're pretty good, and you should be proud. Just like Jordan in baseball, you came into concurrent teaching with tremendous teaching skills, pedagogical knowledge, content knowledge, and a toolbox of techniques. You've switched sports, but you brought plenty of good stuff with you to help you get by. And you're doing pretty stinking good at this new sport. And not perfect, not as good as the other sport, but pretty good. And as Francona said, give Jordan some more at-bats, and he would have gotten even better. And that's the same for us. Every day, we get better at this. Just remind yourself of that. Even Jordan was only average when he started doing something new. But every day he improved. And if he had more time, he may have been a superstar on the baseball field. We never found out if he would because he went back to the NBA, won 3 more championships, 2 more MVP awards, and countless other accolades. And the good news is that we get to do the same. Someday, we'll be off the metaphorical baseball field, which I love baseball, so maybe I don't want to leave baseball, but you get my point. We'll be off the metaphorical baseball field, out of the minor leagues, and back on the metaphorical basketball court, hoisting trophies above our heads. And we'll be even better then than we were before this detour that we've taken. So, when your concurrent lesson doesn't go as well as you had hoped, just tell yourself, I am Michael Jordan playing baseball. But soon, I'll be Michael Jordan playing basketball again. If you enjoyed today's Soapbox Moment, please consider telling a friend or sharing about it on social media. It really helps them discover the work that I'm trying to do here on the Educational Duct Tape podcast. Next, a request. If you enjoyed today's episode, and I think you will, I'd be honored if you'd head over to Apple Podcasts and leave a review for the show. It's that little piece of social proof that a fellow educator might need to turn them from a podcast browser to a full-fledged duct taper. And not only might your review help another educator make the decision to start listening, but it'll also help me. Seriously, this has been a tough couple of years for all of us as educators, and little things like someone telling you that you're doing something good really helps. So if you enjoy this episode and you could spare a minute, a review would put a big old smile on my face.
Today's guest.
All right, today my guest is the podfather himself, Chris Nesi. Chris is a high school social studies teacher and university professor who has inspired students and teachers at all levels. Technology and its role in education are his professional passion. He also hosts a number of podcasts, including the House of EdTech, Podcast PD, The Chase for 28, and Knock Knock, Who's There? He's also the founder of the Education Podcast Network, which I'm sure you're aware of because you hear about the Education Podcast Network at the beginning of every episode of this show. You can find Chris on Twitter at Mr. Nesi and his main podcast, The House of EdTech, at House of EdTech. Are the people on Podcast PD going to be offended that I said that? They might be, but that's okay. Chris's main podcast, I've said it. It's now in the podcast. Everybody knows is the House of EdTech. You could also find him on Instagram at House of EdTech and on his website, chrisnesi.com, but not just on his website or on Instagram or on Twitter or on any of those podcasts, but here in this podcast is the Chris Nesi. How's it going, Chris?
Gake Miller. Wait, is it Gake or Jake?
What are you launching into a GIF battle as soon as we start?
I am Team GIF, Jake.
Team GIF, and I am Gake Miller, I guess. Wow, look at that.
I just wanted to come out the gates and give you something for that giggle reel at the end of 2022.
Right. You just made it. Shots fired with the Gake Miller. Jen Jiffin is going to be pretty mad about this.
Hello, Jen.
That's amazing, Chris. So I got to tell you, Chris, this podcast exists in much part because of your podcast, because of the House of EdTech. So I was a listener to the House of EdTech back in probably 2018 or so. I probably started listening to it, and amongst a couple other podcasts, Google Teacher Tribe, which became the Google Teacher Podcast and things like that, and decided I wanted my own podcast. And you did a 2 or 3 episode series on podcasting that was one of the things that led me down this road. So thanks for that.
You're welcome. So really what you're saying is you listened to my show and thought, I can do that better. So you had to come up with your own show because there's something I wasn't doing. And let me tell you, Jake, I'm a fan of your podcast and I've been listening since day one. I have never missed an episode. So if there is some secret group or button you give out to from the beginning listeners, I want to get on that list.
I do need that.
But
it should be like a sports coat. It should be like a sports coat with like a special patch on it. That's like, I'm an initial listener. I'm an initial duct taper. That's amazing, Chris. You know what it is? And it's one of my favorite things about podcasting is in education, especially, is that, I know you're in jest saying doing it better, but it's doing it differently, right? Because we all have our own like things that we enjoy when we listen to podcasts. So like you and I both host EdTech podcasts, and we're 2 of 50, 100, 200, like how many EdTech podcasts? Like, I think those are all underestimates. I mean, potentially more than 1,000 podcasts about educational technology out there, and they all have their own merit. It's just that they all do it differently, right? And there's one for everybody,
Well, you and I have both presented on podcasting at conferences, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But that's the beautiful thing about podcasting. It's your perspective on education technology. House of EdTech is my point of view. Is there some crossover? Is there some adjacent possible between the two shows? Absolutely. Yeah. So it's not a matter of only listen to Chris or only listen to Jake. It's listen to Chris when his comes out, then listen to Jake's when his comes out. Listen to My EdTech Life with Alfonso Mendoza. There are so many out there, right? Yeah. So it's just a matter of when you listen. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's one of the great things too, is that when you listen, everybody can listen when they listen, right? I love looking back and seeing like episodes from 2 years ago still getting listened to, right? And seeing people just picking things up whenever fits for them. That's one of my favorite parts about podcasting is it's there for you whenever you need it, right? Sometimes you don't want to listen to a podcast. Sometimes you want to listen to this kind of podcast. And like you're saying, they're all there for you. There's choices and there's lots of stuff available. But here we are preaching to the choir, right? We're like, hey, podcast listeners, you know what's great? Podcasts. Like, why are you telling me about this? I know. Oh gosh. Okay. So Chris, before you know the rules here, before we get into the actual educational duct tape of this interview, of this episode, we've got to play a game. You ready for a game?
I am ready, Jake. Let's do it.
2 truths and 1 lie.
Okay. We are going to play a game of 2 truths and 1 lie. Even though my record on 2 truths and 1 lie, I should go back and count it up, is like 10 and 50, like 10 wins and 50 losses. I just cannot do this. I can't guess the lie, but you're going to give me 3 statements. 2 will be true, 1 will be a lie, and I will try to guess which one the lie is. Are you ready?
I am ready. I just have to say, as again, somebody who's listened to every episode, you are really bad at this game. I listen as a listener. I'm like, oh, clearly that's the lie. And I'm like, how can he not do this? So,
and I'm not faking it. I like really am just that bad at it for some reason. Apparently people can lie to me whenever they want, and I will not know.
Listener, write that down.
Right. Or when they're honest to me, I'll be like, you're lying. Like, I have no idea.
All right. I am ready to play. Are we ready to do this?
I'm ready. Go for it.
All right. Here we go. I have been on daytime television. I have performed stand-up comedy on Broadway. I have taken batting practice at Yankee Stadium.
Wow. That's a list. Right. So I believe the Yankee Stadium one, because I know, I mean, that'd be pretty awesome. Right. But I know you're a Yankees guy, right? The Chase for 28 podcast is a Yankees focused podcast, isn't it? Is that accurate?
That's right. Do that with AJ Bianco. Yep.
Nice. And so I'm going to believe that one. That would be something really legendary and amazing, but I'm going to believe it's true. The other one's daytime TV and what was the other? Stand-up comedy on Broadway. I'm thinking, not only am I going to guess this correctly, I'm going to be specific. I think you've been on daytime TV and it was an episode of Days of Our Lives. So the lie, is that you have done stand-up comedy on Broadway.
All right. So this is where I divulge the truth, right?
Yes, divulge.
Well, Jake, your streak continues. You lose again.
It wouldn't be the show if I didn't get this wrong, right?
That's right. So the lie, I have never taken batting practice at Yankee Stadium.
What? The one I was most confident in, Chris?
I gave you all the rope you needed.
Oh man. Right. You sure did. Okay. All right. So, and by the way, I went to the old Yankee Stadium. I did a tour a year or 2 ago before it closed down. They were building the other one next door already. It was, I don't know, 15 years ago or something. And I'm a Cleveland Guardians fan, I should say. And even I enjoyed that tour. Cool place. But I did not get to take batting practice there. So now you got to tell me what the real lie is. So, no, that's the real lie. See, I can't play this game. Now you got to tell.
I'll tell you the stories of my truths.
Yes, that is thank you for knowing what I want to say before I know what I want to say.
We're podcast brethren.
Right.
So
exactly.
Daytime TV. Maybe I even should have said morning TV. I was thinking daytime, morning.
That's the day.
But back in 2006, I appeared on an episode of The Rachel Ray Show on ABC.
No way.
I was a guest.
Were you cooking?
Sort of. I am known as the substitution guy. So I've got that video on YouTube. I will send the link to you, and people can go and check out my appearance on The Rachel Ray Show back in 2006 because of how I substitute ingredients in the kitchen. Now, I will say this is from 2006. I'm married a long time. I can cook now. But back then, I made some horrendous decisions in the kitchen.
It's been fixed ever since. Yes, we will put that link in the show notes for sure. I can't wait to see that. So now we've got, in Educational Duct Tape podcast history, we've got you, who's cooked on Rachel Ray. We've got Joe Marquez, who tried to get a washing machine or something back from an ex-girlfriend on Judge Judy or something like that. We've got Dr. Natasha Rachel, who was on Hanging with Mr. Cooper, and we've got Nairi Clark, who was on, I forget what she couldn't remember what she was on, but we've got 4 TV stars on the show, and there's probably some I'm forgetting here too, that were on some. That's crazy. Okay, so now stand-up comedy on Broadway, right?
Yes. So my senior year in college, I wasn't able to take underwater basket weaving, but I took a stand-up comedy class, and the final exam for the class was to do a 5-minute set at Caroline's on Broadway in New York City.
What? How'd it go?
I'm a teacher, Jake.
Yeah.
That's how well it went.
I think that sounds like it went well. Did it go well?
I got an A.
Yeah.
I invited my family and they were mortified by my 5 minutes of comedy. And my high school English teacher, who directed me in high school plays, gave me a hug and said that was interesting. And
interesting.
I will tease. So here's what the set involved. And one day when we're getting cheesesteaks in Philly again,
yes.
I'll do the whole thing. But so back in 2003, 2004, as the time frame, my set included content that revolved around The Passion of the Christ, that James Caviezel movie, and Disney and Mickey Mouse.
Yeah, that's a combination right there.
I got an A. That's all I can say.
That's some stuff. Yeah, I want to hear that set. It'll be over Philly cheesesteaks, but I want to hear it. That's amazing. Isn't it crazy thinking back to our Education Podcast Network meetup in Philly at Gino's or Ray's or whoever, somebody's cheesesteaks place. I don't know. You're going to correct me and tell me I'm crazy for not knowing the difference.
Pat's and Gino's.
Gino's or Pat's. I don't know. But that's been how many years? It's been like 2.5 years now, and we haven't gotten to do an ISTE like that again. I miss it.
Feels like a decade ago, Jake, to be honest with you.
It really does. It really and truly feels like a decade ago, which makes me feel old, and I don't even know. All right, Chris. So now that we have played a game and had some fun, and I showed how bad I am at said game, we're going to get into a game that I always win or tie. I always tie with my guest at this game. We both win. Everybody wins. Everybody wins in the educational duct tape question, because it's a question that a teacher might have about something they're trying to do in their classroom or trying to fix in their classroom, or a goal that they have in their classroom, and a question that a real educator might have. And then we try to answer that question with educational technology, or as I call it, educational duct tape, because just like duct tape, these technologies are a tool to do other things we want to do in the classroom. So whatever that question or goal or need or problem is, the duct tape or the technology helps us solve that problem. Are you up for this less silly version of podcast interviewing right now?
I am, Jake.
He's in. So my question for you is appropriate because you are the creator of the Education Podcast Network, and you've been podcasting for more than a decade, and you host multiple podcasts, and multiple people who are in podcasting consider you as the person that, they credit for getting them into podcasting. And actually, just in the most recent episode with Stephanie Howell, she said that you pushed her into podcasting. So you even got a shout out in that one. So the question is, how can we get students started with podcasting? And before we dive into our answer, I think it's important to note that sometimes the question I ask directly implies a technology like this one. Obviously, you can't podcast without some technology, but there's a lot of teacher questions that are under the hood of this one, right? Maybe you want students literally creating a podcast. Maybe you just want to hear from your students. Maybe you're trying to find a different way to replace maybe the 5-paragraph essay. Maybe you're just trying to assess your students. There's a lot of reasons you might want a podcast, but I think the big question is, how do we get started? How do we make that happen? So let's start with the basics. So let's say I'm Joe teacher and I have never podcasted myself, and my students haven't podcasted, and we're not even sure if it's going to stick. What are some things I could do early on to kind of get our feet wet, to dip our toes in the water of podcasting?
I think first and foremost, and this is similar to your education duct tape mindset, is there's a podcasting mindset. And just like educational duct tape doesn't revolve around the specific tech, it's just, the tools in the toolbox. When we talk about podcasting, it's very similar in that we can have a whole conversation about podcasting and we don't have to talk about the tech. Mm-hmm. There's so much different technology out there to help people, whether it's students, teachers, to create the content that we can just kind of take a look at. Well, how do we get started? So our students have passions, right? So we can encourage students to find ways to talk about their passions. If we're looking at the content of our courses, and I'll speak from my perspective as a high school history teacher, Jake, you rock middle school science. Mm-hmm. So it's about giving students the opportunity to let us know what they know. And one of the ways that I think it's overlooked is speaking and getting students to talk about what they know and what they understand about content, Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I totally agree. Yeah. There's our goal as an educator for why we might want to do it, right? There are some situations where maybe you're teaching some kind of tech-based course where the focus is the podcasting, or it's a course, a communications course, maybe where you're introducing podcasting. But in general, we want to hear from our students. We want to hear their thinking. We want to be able to assess their understanding. And sometimes the ways we do it traditionally aren't getting at the information we need to get at, you know?
Right. And when we're talking about in schools and in our classrooms, it's not about getting your students to launch a podcast that's on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and can be accessible worldwide. While it's nice to have that worldwide authentic audience, school would be the place to show them how to do some of these things and build up the skills before we turn them loose on the world. Gee, I don't know, like we do with everything else in education.
Right.
Give the classroom the place to be where they practice, they learn, they fail, they make mistakes, right? There's no right way to do it, but there's certainly a lot of mistakes that people could make. And I think right off the bat is thinking that as the teacher, I've got to know everything there is to know about podcasting. You don't need to know anything about it. And B, that it has to be a podcast like we listen to. It doesn't have to be serial. You don't have to have your students creating an NPR quality podcast to say that they are podcasting. It can be as simple as recording some audio into Google Slides or using Mote or Flipgrid to just get them to speak, right? And podcasting is so much more than the audio. Podcasting is the research, the script writing, some of the tech, the audio editing. Podcasting could be video. Podcasting, Jake, I don't know if you know this, podcasting could be a PDF file, right? It's just something that gets sent to you, something you subscribe to. Yeah. So there's all different ways to approach podcasting.
Yeah. So you and I are both listeners to a podcast called The Feed, right? That Libsyn, the podcasting company, puts out. And one of the two hosts of The Feed, Rob Welch, talks about what the technical definition of podcasting is. It has to be an RSS file and it's downloaded and all this stuff like that. And while that's true to meet the technical requirements of podcasting, I like what you're saying here, which is in our situation, especially in the classroom, you don't have to fit these certain parameters to have your students podcasting. You just have to meet the needs that you have. Like, what are your goals? What do you have available? What works best for you and your students and your content? And how are you going to make it happen? It doesn't have to be a certain format or a certain quality to meet those requirements of podcasting with your students.
Right. And again, it goes back to, and again, we're on educational duct tape. So it's not about the tool. It's about the right tool at the right time. So it's about creating the right type of, I'm going to put air quotes up, the right kind of podcast that fits your needs.
Yeah. Today's episode of the Educational Duct Tape Podcast is brought to you by Toddle Ties, who would like you to know that the Inquiry Educator Summit is back. Get ready for a festival of learning like no other, with thought leaders like Sugatra Mitra, Dylan William, Kath Murdoch, Ron Richart, Sylvia Duckworth, and over 100 other speakers across 10 plus unique session formats. And what's new? Ties 2022 gives you opportunities to foster lifelong connections and build your professional learning network through one-on-one meetups, reflection circles, job-alike sessions, book discussions, and much more. In addition, make sure you transfer learnings to your classroom with a 3-month post-conference experience. Get hands-on with inquiry gurus and take away a toolbox of strategies to apply in your context. You could choose to attend Ties 2022 solo or save big by attending as a group. As listeners of the Educational Duct Tape Podcast, the first 100 of you who get your Ties 2022 pass can get 20% off on your pass. Simply use the code TIES 2022 EDT at checkout. So head to www.toddleapp.com/ties today and save big on your pass now. You mentioned a couple things. So I called this idea micro podcasting, and I didn't come up with micro podcasting. I first heard it through somebody for Mote, and I'm not sure which person for Mote said it first. But that's where I first heard it. And Mote is one of the ways to micro podcast, whether you're doing it in Google Slides, which is where I'd recommend it. So you could put an audio file right there in your slides. People can listen to it. You could share those slides. Other people could see it. You can collaborate on those slides. Other people can record audio. That's one way to micro podcast. You also mentioned Flipgrid. It could just be videos. As you said, it doesn't necessarily have to be audio only to be a podcast, but in Flipgrid, you can also have microphone only and not have the camera on at all. So it could be a little closer to a podcast format if you do Flipgrid. Some of the other ones I love for doing that are Padlet. You could put audio files in Padlet. Seesaw, if you use Seesaw as your learning management system, has some great features for audio in it. And Book Creator also does pretty much everything, including audio. And there are other options out there. But what I like about all of these is you can pick something that you're already using for other stuff, whether it's Google Slides or Flipgrid or Padlet or Seesaw or Book Creator, and just start hearing student voice in there, right? Or student video too in with that voice. And then you could start to see the power of the student voice and see if you want to push it further or if that's far enough. Oh,
absolutely. Again, you just have to, as I've said for a couple of years now, you just kind of just have to hit record and see what happens. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect, right? There are no steadfast rules that must be followed if you want anybody to podcast. There's just some best practices, and those are very flexible.
Yeah. I always think about, as a creator of content, whether it's a book or a podcast or a speaking presentation or something like that, the first version of it is never the same as the later versions, right? There's things that I realized throughout the creation process and throughout the shipping of the content process that I realized need to be changed and could be different and need to be leaned into that were a small part of the original, or need to be leaned away from that were a part of the original. And so you really can't find that stuff out until you put it out there. So you put out that imperfect podcast or imperfect whatever it is, and then start to kind of hone your ideas as you go, as you continue to create that content.
Definitely. And you and I both have done that over the times that we've done our shows. And the benefit for us being teachers is that we can speak to students about our own experiences having done it. We've hit the road bumps. We've hit the speed bumps. We've made changes to our content and our own shows over the years, and we can speak to that. You know, my students understand and they know about the different shows that I do. I don't think they listen to any of them, but that's neither here nor there. It's just a matter of we can speak to it. And for the teacher who isn't a podcaster, well, then you have the great opportunity to model for your students you learning to do something new right along with them. Yeah. And I think that too often that doesn't happen, or we miss those opportunities because some teachers are afraid to not know how to do something in front of their kids. And this shouldn't be an obstacle or a barrier to doing it with students or having students do it.
Yeah, it's super comfortable to do something with students that you already know how to do, but as you're saying, there's huge benefits as well to doing things that you don't already know how to do. So while there might be some cons to that, it might take a little longer. You might hit some speed bumps. You might go down some detours and end up turning around, going a different way, some dead ends. There are gains in what you've modeled to your students by doing it. So even though it's nice to already know how to do something. So when you start podcasting with your students, or when I start podcasting with my students, it's going to be a lot different from when somebody else does it who's never podcasted before. But there's still going to be benefits to that newbie doing podcasting with their students that we're not going to be able to crack into there.
Definitely. And one example that I'll give where I lived it in my classroom, not knowing how to do something. So now we're going back 2 years pre-pandemic. I had some students and I was interested in TikTok. So we'll stay on the content creation train. I was interested in learning about TikTok. I didn't know anything about it, didn't have an account, but I was aware of it. So I put it out there to my high school kids as I think what could be a valuable content creation tool for you to show me what you know about topic XYZ. And I had a number of students start to use the app to create video the way that they were creating content on TikTok. And I said, I have no idea how to use this. Show me. So I was looking at their phone. They showed me how to use the sound effects and do the clips and the different things. And they showed me what they knew, and they taught me a heck of a lot about the platform. And I was vulnerable, and anybody can do that.
Yeah. Yeah, and the students see a lot in you when they do that, right? That risk taking and seeing themselves as an expert in something, and seeing their as a young person, seeing their knowledge that's a different knowledge set and their things that they are into being valued by an adult. I think there's a lot of benefits to it that aren't pedagogical different benefits. And then they are too, actually, but there's just a lot of benefits to it, I think.
Yeah. And they didn't pick on me. They didn't tease me.
They then went and watched your TikToks you posted, and they picked on you behind your back, I'm sure.
Yes.
Okay, so that gets us through the idea of just kind of dipping our toes in the water of recording and of doing a little bit of podcasting and of modeling that risk-taking behavior of trying something new out. I think the next part of it is some of our students have never listened to a true podcast. And I think you actually kind of brought something up that I wasn't really thinking about, even though they haven't listened to a true podcast, maybe not. They've listened to TikToks and they've listened to Instagram Reels and they've listened to Twitch videos and they've listened to YouTubers and they've listened to YouTube Lives. So they know the format pretty well already. But let's say we want to get them exposed to listening to a true podcast. We're probably not going to send them a link to an episode of House of EdTech or Educational Duct Tape or anything from the Education Podcast Network. Even though they're all phenomenal shows, they're not geared towards our students, they're geared towards the educators. So do you have any wisdom on getting stuff for students to listen to?
Well, I talk about the podcast that I enjoy and I let them know. It helps to let the kids get to know you. So there's that aspect of it too. So I share a lot of the podcasts that I listen to with students. I have what I call my guilty pleasure podcast, the sports podcasts I listen to, some of the entertainment ones, and I model for them and I let them know specifically if there's something you're interested in and you're passionate about and you love to learn more about, go to Uncle Google and type in what you like and then add the word podcast to your search.
Yeah.
And you can find and listen to stuff and try things. And I said to kids, you're not going to like everything you listen to, but there's a lot you can try out there.
Yeah.
I will bring in ducks, the whole thing. I bring in podcasts related to history for my kids to listen to. So I make podcasts a part of my class as a resource. So I'm fighting the good fight to familiarize at least my 160 kids with podcasts. And, you who's listening, you can do the same thing. Yeah. Find the podcast in your content area that's age appropriate. If you're an elementary school teacher, find a storytelling podcast. Maybe find a podcast with an awesome 9-year-old kid. It might be called Knock Knock Who's There, where you can hear a child doing a podcast and you can give them good examples, whether it's storytelling. Again, what you share with your students and what we listen to is going to make us do a couple of things. They're going to make us think. They're going to make us laugh. They might cry. They're going to make us feel something. So teach your kids how to find the content that they want to listen to. Mm-hmm. They already know how to do that on YouTube. They can do it on Instagram. They can do it on Twitch. Now you're just telling them to add the word podcast to the search.
Yeah, I like that a lot. That's a good point. And I think there are some good kind of networks and websites and things like that curate podcasts that are good for kids. And I'll put a link to a few of them in the notes. But I think that what you're saying here of number one, teaching them to find their own, and number two, curating ones yourself that relate to your content area to then kind of expose it to them as a learning experience about the content, but also about podcasting is two great ways to do it. I think that's probably the best ways to do it is maybe show, like for me to grab something we're learning about in 8th grade science and bringing that podcast in, that introduce them to podcasting, and then teach them how to just go search and find their own. I don't need some curated list. I have that. Like they can then take it from there, I think.
Yeah. And you can even, if you've got students that are of age where they've got cell phones, which really doesn't narrow it down. I mean, you got 1st and 2nd graders that have cell phones, but if you've got students that are also leveraging something like Spotify, you don't even have to have them worry about the Apple Podcasts app or Google Podcasts. So many podcasts are in Spotify. So if you've got students who are already using Spotify to consume the music they love, just show them how they can find a podcast in there too. Yeah. And maybe even, we can curate a playlist of songs. You might, as a class, be able to curate with your students a list of relevant podcasts that the whole class enjoys, or maybe that relate to a topic you're teaching, or just for fun.
Yeah, I love that. And that's great. Okay, so now we touched on how to make kind of micro podcasts, as I call it. We talked about how to getting them interested in listening to podcasts. Now, the next step, if we're looking to truly go into podcasting, so let's now step a little bit deeper into the wading pool of podcasting. So the first thing I want to shout out before we talk about some of the platforms and tools is the Pod Journal that you created recently, a little less than a year ago. I think it came out and is available to lead students or teachers through the podcasting experience. And we'll link to it in the show notes, but tell everybody a little bit about the Pod Journal.
So the Pod Journal is, if you who's listening, you've ever written in a journal for anything, fitness, health, meditation, anything like that, the Pod Journal is like that, but to help the user plan their podcast in a physical, tangible way. Sure, you could do this in a Google Sheet or a Google Doc to plan episodes of a podcast, but the Pod Journal is a physical printed book that you could plan up to 100 episodes to just physically write down who the guest is, when you want to release it, what are some questions, how do you want to structure your episode. So it's a great tangible tool to plan a podcast that's could be valuable in a classroom. It could be valuable for you if you're thinking of starting your own podcast for either education or just for fun. It's that type of tool.
Yeah, I agree. And what I like about it is you could use it to kind of guide you, as we were saying earlier, in taking those first steps. And then as you get into it, you might realize the differences in the ways that you personally do things. Like maybe like you, for example, in there's a section for what are the episode topics and what are the conversation topics. Maybe once you're going, you realize you don't need both of those. You just need one of those. Or maybe you need more blanks in one of them than the other one. But it's a good for getting people started with the process. I think it's a really good tool to use for guiding what a podcaster thinks about when they start podcasting.
And then for somebody who starts, there's also some pages in there that will hopefully prompt the user to reflect and think about what they've done and what they want to do going forward at different points through that potentially 100 episode journey.
Yeah, nice. I love that idea of the reflection there because I know that's been a big part of the process of what I've done with my own podcast is that reflection. But some people, they need that push to do that reflecting. Okay, so let's say now we have dipped our toes in the water. We've done some of that micro podcasting. We've taught our students how to listen to some podcasts so they kind of hear and get an idea for what a podcast might feel like. They've gotten the Pod Journal and they're laying out some episodes to be able to put together some episodes. Now let's say we actually want to get into some legit podcasting with our students. So I think we kind of got to break this up here and talk about let's talk the stuff inside of our computer or iPad first. So what tools do you recommend for maybe recording, maybe editing within the computer? So before we get to hardware, what kinds of things do you recommend for that?
Anything that will record audio. So
yes.
For example, if I am on a laptop, yes. Windows, Mac, I don't know if there are Linux laptops in schools anywhere in this country, but there might be. Mm-hmm. I would recommend something as simple as Audacity to capture audio. It's free. It is, I think, easy to use. And I say that because that's what I've been using to edit my podcast since 2014. And all the shows that I edit, I just use Audacity. So it's free and readily available to capture audio. Mm-hmm. Now, Jake, you might be thinking, what if I have a Chromebook? Well, there is some hacky workaround way that you can get Audacity on a Chromebook, but there are also some great web-based recording tools out there, such as Twisted Wave, Soundtrap, and Soundtrap for EDU. And basically, if you just go out to Google and you search, web-based audio editor, there's a bunch of tools out there. Now, as you go and explore them, you might have to go and get things on block based on your district's filtering policies. So if it works on your computer, just make sure it works on a student's computer as well, which is just a great ed tech tip anyway.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I'm heartbroken that I recently discovered that my favorite thing to recommend for Chromebook users no longer exists. It was called Beautiful Audio Editor. And it was a tool that worked with Google Drive, and you recorded and saved the files in Google Drive, and it's just gone. It just kind of disappeared. That website redirects to like a a 404 error or something or other. So that one's gone. But I agree. Twisted Wave works. Soundtrap is the one that I am the most interested in. I haven't really started to explore it. I've started dabbling with it a little bit. But Soundtrap has that EDU plan, like you mentioned, where the teacher can oversee what the student is doing.
Let me speak to that for just one second about Soundtrap. So Soundtrap, the not EDU version, they're both good.
Yeah.
And I've got experience with both. Here's the problem. The Soundtrap for EDU is pay. There is a bit of a trial period, but then once that trial period's over, that's it.
Yeah.
So the EDU version does make it easy to build projects, have your students collaborate. And I believe that there is a difference between regular Soundtrap and Soundtrap EDU in terms of their COPA and FERPA compliance, which I'll be honest, frustrates me because there's no free version of Soundtrap that students can use without you having the district or you paying for the seats and the licenses. So that's me just venting a little bit.
I agree. Yeah, I'm with you on that for sure. The education one looks phenomenal, and it just stinks that there's no free version of the education one. A trial is great, but a trial is only good enough if you're happy with it and want to pay for it. Otherwise, it's just going for 2 months or 1 month or whatever it is down a rabbit hole that you can no longer go down anymore.
And I found that out recently this very school year. I had students do a podcasting project and said, "All right, I'm gonna jump into Soundtrap for EDU, set it up." Got all my kids with their accounts and then went through the whole thing. The trial ended. And then I had some students say, "Hey, I want to get back to those files." And I said, "You can't."
Yeah.
And they're like, "What do you?" And so I had to explain to them. So it was frustrating.
Yeah.
But while you were talking before, I also thought of, something like Screencastify, mute your camera. Again, any way you can capture, if you just want to do audio, any way you can just capture audio, that's all you need to do.
Yeah. Oh, and Screencastify, you could export as an MP3 file too.
Export as an MP3. And again, it can be uploaded to a Google site. It can be uploaded to Google Slides. You can link to it in a Google Doc. So there are just so many ways that you can make it accessible.
Yeah, I agree. So Audacity you mentioned I believe is the most widely used, or if it's not, it's pretty close to it. Most widely used, what they call a DAW, a DAW, a digital audio workstation. So a most widely used place for recording and editing audio. I tried it out and I just didn't like it for some reason. There was something about the way it edited that just didn't match the way my brain was going about it. So I used GarageBand. But as you said at the beginning of this question, or this part of this question, was it doesn't matter. It just has to record audio, right? You just have to be able to, you have to end with audio is all that matters.
Yeah. When people listen to this or they listen to any podcast, you don't know what they edited in, right? It's Audacity. It's GarageBand. It's, what's the Adobe one? Adobe Audition. There are so many tools out there, but once you listen, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I agree.
Or to the listener, they don't care how the sausage is made.
Right. Well, maybe they do. They don't care how the podcast is made. They probably care how the sausage is made. The other one we didn't mention in there too that I want to throw in too is WeVideo, because just like Screencastify, you could do audio and WeVideo too. Okay, so we've talked about how now to record it and to edit it. So now let's say we really want people to listen to our podcast, which this is the one step I always tell teachers. This step doesn't have to happen with your students, right? It doesn't have to go any further than this step. It could be just for you and the student, or just for you and the student in your class. It doesn't have to go any further than that. But let's say you do want to publish the content. So where do we go to then for that step?
Well, again, so it's there's a road with a fork in the woods, Jake. So it's, do I want it to be available as a podcast, or how do I just make it available for anybody besides me as the teacher and the kids in class to listen to? So, and one of these lets you go down both roads. So obviously there's Anchor. If you have and want to start maybe a class podcast and kind of put this stuff out there, you as the teacher could have an account and upload these MP3 files created by your students and push it out to the world, right? If your students are old enough, you could encourage them to start their own accounts if they really get into it, and that serves the purpose of your project or what you want them to do with podcasting. But then depending on the age of your students, maybe it's as simple as putting these files on a Google site that parents have access to, or sharing the audio files on your learning management system, whether it's posting to Google Classroom or Seesaw or some other place where you're connecting with your parents or your school community.
Yeah.
Maybe on your teacher webpage through your learning management system or your SIS at school. So,
so those are
options.
some good ways to do it, kind of where you get certain people to be able to listen, maybe your community, maybe the parents, maybe students from the other classes in your building. Maybe it's not being found by people elsewhere, but maybe that's not your goal. And so you're right, Google Classroom, just a Google Drive file and publish that link to it somewhere. Anywhere that you can host a file can typically work for just that piece. And then you mentioned that if you're then looking to actually make it out there for people who listen to podcasts to potentially listen to, Anchor tends to be the one that people gravitate towards because it's free and it's easy to use. Not that I've used it. I've watched some videos on how it works and things like that. But Anchor is not to be used by anybody under the age of 13. And technically, it's not to be used by anybody under the age of 18 in most areas unless they have parent or legal guardian consent. So it's a little bit slippery. Sure, you could, have some paperwork signed by parents to make this work in your school, or do what you're suggesting, which is you own the account, you publish the audio. The students maybe don't say their name in it or don't say their last name in it, so not identifiable. But Anchor could be a little bit of a slippery slope. Easy, free, but in terms of privacy, it's not going to work out for most schools, I don't think.
Right. So you bring up the privacy concerns. So if a teacher goes through the proper channels, I think some of those obstacles can be overcome. But again, it depends on, is that the purpose of why you're doing the podcasting?
Right.
Is it to actually put their voice out for the world?
Right.
And I think you're going to run into some of those obstacles with any other media host. Maybe it's Spreaker or Libsyn like you and I use.
Yeah.
So there's a number of tools out there that you could explore. But again, it comes down to student privacy.
Yeah.
And do you want to actually put their voice out there? Does their voice need to be out there? Is that necessary?
Not only minding their privacy, but thinking, is it even worth worrying about privacy, or is just doing this within our walled garden in our school setting good enough, right? And so you and I both use Libsyn. I love Libsyn. Libsyn is a paid service, but for somebody looking to go kind of maybe long term with their podcast, I think it's a great way to go. The other one here is Soundtrap, as we were talking about earlier. If you use that paid Soundtrap for EDU, you can then use it with younger students, and it has a walled garden where other people can listen to those podcasts, even parents. So if that's a road that people are able to go down, it offers a pretty awesome solution for that there, I think.
Yeah. And actually, real quick, I'll say that, in my school, I recently just became the advisor of the podcasting club, which, surprise, I started, so I get to be the advisor. And we're doing a live morning show for the high school that I teach in.
Nice.
And we're using a mishmash. We are duct taping this thing together like nobody's business, Jake. So we're using Spreaker to be able to broadcast the audio live on our website. In conjunction, we're also using StreamYard to live stream the audio to our Twitter account for this morning show. And then I'm using Anchor to host these daily episodes in perpetuity because it's the free media host.
Nice.
So
awesome.
It's a combination of doing live radio and then still having it available in podcast form after the fact using those multitude of tools.
Yeah. So does Spreaker not host files long-term?
Spreaker, like with Libsyn, you and I, we pay for storage based on actual storage. Spreaker gives you time. So the free account, you get so much time to upload, and then you have to take down the oldest stuff. So I just clear that out every week, and Anchor is where it's living forever. Right. And I'm using Anchor to push it to Spotify. And I'm not worried about Apple Podcasts at this level because all the students in my school, they're all over Spotify. Yeah, so I'm just pushing Spotify.
Yeah. Now you could push to Apple from Anchor too, though, right?
Yes, I could. I haven't submitted it. I'm sorry.
No. I'm just making sure I'm correct on that but I agree with you. Most students are on Spotify and they could use free Spotify to listen to it, and they'd be more than happy to do that. I was more interested in the Spreaker part because I'm aware of it, but I didn't know why not to use it. And that makes sense because of the paying. If you want to have all of your podcasts stay up there in perpetuity, as you said there. Are there any drawbacks to using Anchor aside from the age restrictions?
The only thing that I've talked about is if you let Anchor submit the podcast everywhere for you, then you lose a little control over access to certain statistics and information about your show. So occasionally these places where you submit a podcast, they'll email you as the podcaster. And if you let Anchor do all the submitting, the email that is used is a generic Anchor email, and it's not your email. So you just want to make sure if you use Anchor that you manually submit the RSS feed, all the places you want it to be, because then you have complete control over it.
Yeah.
And, think of it like a radio signal. You as a radio station would want to have control over the signal. You don't want, 107.3 controlling your 96.9 signal, right? So just make sure you submit it what I think would be the right way. And if you've got questions about that, email Jake, email me, and I'll help you do that.
I thought you were going to say just email Jake, like ask Jake. Like, I'm not going to answer.
Or don't email Jake, email me.
No, both of us will answer. Pick one of us and email one of us, and we'll answer. But I've never used Anchor, so maybe they should email you if it's about Anchor, because you've used it with students. So that's good to know. So the other part here, and I saved this one for last, because it is the least important part of this discussion, I think, and that is equipment. If you want to go long-term into this and you want to someday have a podcast that's on the Education Podcast Network with Chris and I, then this becomes an important question. But if you're just trying to get students' voices out there, equipment is not really that important. There's my soapbox for today. You're good enough, or my high horse maybe for today. You're good enough with just the built-in microphones, as long as the audio is tolerable to the listener, I think. But there are some inexpensive ways to get some equipment, and it brings some student excitement too, to see like legit microphones and things like that. So what's on your short list of tools you're recommending to teachers?
My short list, if you're going to invest money in a microphone or microphones for your school or your classroom, I recommend two different options. One is the Samson Q2U. It is and you've talked about this before, Jake. It's a USB and XLR microphone. And if you are the layperson, you can connect it to your computer, Mac, Windows, Chromebook, with a USB cable. Plug and play. It's ready to go. You're going to sound like $1 million. Yep. The other option,
you're not going to spend $1 million.
No, it's a $70 microphone.
Yep.
And it comes with the stand. It comes with the cables. So it gives you what you need. The other option is the Audio-Technica ATR 2100X, which is the updated version. I believe that's a $70 to $80 microphone. Same premise, USB, XLR, and it's going to give you great sounding audio, not for a bank breaking budget. And it's easy.
Yeah.
It's easy.
And I think when I listen to some NPR podcasts, and I could tell if I really focus on it that they sound better than I sound in my podcast, right? They sound smarter. That I could tell for sure.
Oh, you and me both.
Right. But their audio, if I focus, I'm like, yeah, this audio is better, but I really have to focus. And once I'm listening, I don't even notice, And so even though they've got multiple $100 microphones and they're in rooms where they're soundproof, or they teach their like not anchors, but their respondents that are out there on the scene to be like, go into your hotel closet and surround yourself in pillows and put a blanket over your head so you sound amazing. Like, yeah, that's all great, but you don't need to do that. Those differences are marginal in the audio quality, I think.
Jake, let's prove it to your listener right now.
Okay.
Jake, what microphone are you using and how much did it cost?
I am using the old version of the Audio-Technica ATR 2100X. It probably cost $60 because I got it when it was on a sale on Amazon.
Okay. Jake, I am using the Shure SM7B, which costs almost $400.
Who
you, the
sounds
listener,
better?
You, the listener, is there a difference? I have this microphone because I wanted the microphone.
Yes.
I didn't need it. I wanted it.
And it looks really cool though when you're in StreamYard or something like that, especially with the box, the mic box that you created and added to it. Yours looks a little bit better than mine, but I do think if you listen, you will be like, yeah, Chris's is a little bit better, right? But nobody without focusing on that is going to notice that.
No, and Jake, like I said, I listened to your podcast since day one. and your audio sounds great and you're on an $80 microphone.
Yep.
I used to have a similar $80 microphone. It was a want, not a need. But the microphone, having a microphone does make a difference as opposed to earbuds or talking at your laptop screen.
Yeah. And I think that once you get far enough into this to know that this is something that you're going to do, I definitely think you want to go past regular audio earbuds or something like that for a lot of reasons. But you don't need to go beyond the $60, $70, $80 microphone. I think you will definitely be happy with something like that for sure.
But I will say this too. Content trumps all.
Yep.
If you have good content, people will put up with less than crystal clear audio.
Yeah. Well, a great example of that is our mutual friend, Matt Miller, used to do the Ditch That Textbook podcast, which I hope comes back someday. But he recorded a lot of those interviews on the go, like at conferences and things like that. And I can't remember what he was using, whether he was using earbuds or something. I don't know. It wasn't an expensive microphone. It might have been I think he was holding the phone in his hand and using the built-in microphone on the phone. And the content was so good that I listened to every episode of that podcast.
Case in point. There you go.
Yeah, for sure. And then your very favorite microphone that you want to recommend, do you prefer the Snowball or the Yeti from the company Blue? Which one is the better one?
I didn't want to bring up Jesus Christ's name on this podcast, but Jesus Christ, how dare you? Do not buy snowballs for your classroom. Do not buy for the price of a Blue Yeti. You can get 2 of the microphones that Jake has, right? And now you can have 2 kids on good mics. Just don't buy snowballs and Yetis for your classrooms, please.
I want to get one just to try it out to see if I agree with you, but I
want to get. If I get one, it'll be that I use it to take batting practice with a snowball at Yankee Stadium.
Yankee Stadium. I want to see that video. A lot of teachers are like, that's what we got with our grant, Chris. Like, that's what we have.
Well, then here's this one. Hey, listener, you've got a grant for podcasting and content creation. Email me and I will tell you exactly what you could consider buying.
And the first bullet is don't get a Blue Yeti or a Blue Snowball.
And I see it all the time, Jake. People sharing on Twitter and Instagram that they got their grants, like you just said. And I'm just like, you didn't ask anybody what you should get.
Yeah. And here's so for the listener who might be new to podcasting, the biggest problem with those mics is they're made for scenarios that you don't normally have in a classroom. And so the audio is not going to sound that good. We said earlier, content trumps audio, and you're going to get good enough audio out of them. But I think the overarching point is for the amount of money you're paying for them, you could have gotten better audio with a different tool. So you don't need to pay a lot for a tool, but if you're going to pay $70 or $80 or whatever it is, make sure it's a good one. And the 2 that you mentioned today are great tools to use. If you have special circumstances where maybe those aren't the right ones, maybe because you're recording with an iPad or something like that, then you just ask those questions to people like Chris who know those answers, I think.
Yeah, it's like buying off-brand duct tape, or you buy duct tape just because it's like super popular, when just some 3M will do the job just fine.
Yeah. Although I have a roll of gaff tape. Have you ever used gaff tape before?
It's wonderful tape.
It is amazing. You can do anything with that stuff, right?
Yes. You should do the Gaffer's Tape EDU podcast. No.
I thought about it. Somebody's like, why don't you do that? And I was like, because nobody would know. Nobody know what I was talking about.
That's got to be you got to do an April Fool's joke.
Rebrand the podcast and
just
come up with a big
shot,
announcement that that's the new name of the show. All right. Well, some great recommendations today, Chris. I think the biggest takeaway for people is if you're considering going down any of these roads, reach out to me, or certainly reach out to Chris, because he's got even more expertise on podcasting than I have by a landslide, and ask those questions so that you can make this stuff happen for your students, because I think there's a lot of possible gains from doing these kind of things, small scale or large scale, with your students. Would you agree with that advice, Chris?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you, sir, for being on today. Thank you for making questions in 2 truths and 1 lie that continued my streak of being the worst player of that game ever. It took me way too long to get you on the podcast, but I really appreciate you being here today, Chris. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Can I have a minute with your listener for a second?
Yeah, go ahead. I'm going to walk away and go get a drink. Okay.
All right, cool.
It'll be a stiff one.
All right. Listen, duct taper, you listen to this podcast. I've been listening. We are huge fans of Jake, and I want to tell you something to do. go tell other people about this podcast, not this episode. That's fine, but tell other people you know to go listen and subscribe and show them how to subscribe to this podcast. Help them become duct tapers just like you and just like me. And then if you have time and you're not listening to the House of Ed Tech, consider also subscribing to the House of Ed Tech. But go promote Jake first.
All right,
Jake, you there?
I'm back. What did I miss?
Nothing.
I'm teasing. All right. Thank you for that, Chris. And I think that's such a huge thing to know too, is that the best thing that if you're a person who likes a podcast, one of the best things you could do is help other people find podcasts and get kind of hooked into podcasts and learn from those podcasts and kind of see what's possible in that world. It's that adjacent possible that we talk about, right? Share it with other people. I think, Chris, for talking about that too, you get to pick today's homework for the end of the episode. So for those people who listen all the way to the end, I give a homework assignment every day, and it's to go, or every episode, and it's to go find somebody who is X, whatever this is, and tell them about the podcast. So who should we tell about the podcast this time?
Everybody. Go tell the person who's in the room across from you and the rooms on your left and your right in your school.
That's not fun homework, Chris. I think it should be somebody who likes Philly cheesesteaks, because the first time I met Chris in person, we were eating Philly cheesesteaks. So find an educator who likes Philly cheesesteaks and tell them about educational duct tape and the House of Ed Tech and Podcast PD. And if you got time, if they haven't walked away from you, tell them about Chase for 28 and Knock Knock Who's There, right?
Perfect.
That's your homework. The bell doesn't dismiss you. I dismiss you. First, you have to hear the homework before you go. Thanks for being on today, Chris.
Thank you, Jake. I appreciate it.
I'm so glad I got to have Chris on the podcast finally. I can't believe it took me this long to get him on the show. Chris was one of the first people who inspired me indirectly at the time to get into podcasting. And so having him on to showcase his wisdom about podcasting was really important to me. I, again, can't believe it took me so long to do so. Let's review some of the things that Chris and I talked about. First of all, Chris talked about the podcasting mindset. It doesn't have to be about the tech. Students could just be sharing about their passions or speaking about things they're excited about or about content, and that our goal doesn't have to be to launch our podcasts in Apple Podcasts or to Spotify. We should make our schools and schools and classrooms safe places for our students to fail and learn, and podcasting might be a way to do that. And that podcasting doesn't just have to be an audio file like the one you're listening to right now. It could be slides with audio or PDFs with audio links. It just needs to be the right tool at the right time. Real educational duct tape mindset coming from Chris there. We also talked about some micro podcasting ideas like using Moat with Google Slides or using Flipgrid with the mic only mode, or maybe audio files in Padlet, ways to start bringing that audio piece to maybe scaffold in the idea of actual podcasting. And maybe you get to podcasting and maybe you don't. Maybe you just kind of dabble with just the audio files, and that might be good enough for your classroom too. We talked about some ways to get your students listening to podcasts, which one thing that Chris suggested was just have your students Google things they're interested in and find a podcast for it, or for you to find podcasts relating to your content to get kids, into the idea of listening to podcasts and seeing them as places you can get information from. We talked about Chris's awesome activity book, journal book called the Pod Journal for those of you looking to start podcasting. We talked about some tools for podcast recording and editing like Twisted Wave, Audacity, Soundtrap EDU or the regular Soundtrap, and GarageBand, as well as some tools for publishing like Anchor and maybe doing things like Google Sites or Seesaw or your learning management system. We talked about using Libsyn, which is what I use, Liberated Syndication. We also talked about using Soundtrap EDU. Finally, we talked a little bit about equipment, but we want you to keep in mind that it's not super important what equipment you use. The more important part is the audio. But when you're ready to get into getting some equipment, the two tools we recommended are the Samsung Q2U and the Audio-Technica ATR 2100X. Overall, lots of great information today from Chris, and you could see a breakdown of it and links to everything in the show notes so you can learn more from him. Next up, time for the celebration of the adjacent possible. This is the time where we hear new possibilities from the minds that are adjacent to us, the adjacent possible. Other educators, other duct tapers, you. By hearing from each other and sharing with each other, we add new items to our own adjacent possibilities. Today, for the Adjacent Possible, I'd like to share the hashtag EDU duct tape tweeps since the last episode. These are people who have shared using the hashtag EDU duct tape on social media about the podcast and occasionally about the book Educational Duct Tape as well. And in the past 2 weeks, it's been friend of the show, Jennifer Conti at Conti_Jen, new listener, Jeff Walsdorf at Walsdorf Jeff, old listener and great podcaster himself, Eric Guys at Guys Got Tech Ed, as well as We Got Tech Ed, or Techt. You guys, I've listened to the show, and I always forget if you say Tech Ed or Techt. It's spelled Ed. It's a great show, and I've listened, and I think it's Techt. They say Techt, but I say Tech Ed. Why do we do that? Why does that happen? Next, guy I mentioned earlier on the show, Sean Fahey at Sean J. Fahey. Next up, Brian Carpenter at Brian Carr. Next, Brenda Bolden at Mrs. B. A-T-B-R-E, B at Bree. Bree must be the school you're at, Brenda, I'm guessing. Next, Dr. Lance McLeod at Dr. McLeod. And finally, Robert Maben at rmaben9. That is unfortunately all I've got to share in the Adjacent Possible today because, well, it's not for me to share, it's for you to share, and I need you to share. I've featured everything from the show's Flipgrid, which was very busy back in 2019 and the first half of 2020, everything in the show's SpeakPipe, which has really never been that busy at all, and all of the Apple Podcast reviews, which was also very busy back in 2019, and all of the questions that I've been asked on Twitter as well. Well, that's not entirely true. I have 4 Twitter questions waiting, but they're like research projects, so I'm not ready to take those on yet, which is good news for you because that means if you share something, you're practically guaranteed to be on the next show episode. So why did I say show episode, not just next episode? Anyhow, you could share a video on Flipgrid, and I would use the audio from it, or an audio message on SpeakPipe, or just record and send me a voice memo on your phone or something, or send me a tweet and you'll hear it right here in the show during the Adjacent Possible, the celebration of the Adjacent Possible. All right, last but before least, I've got to tell you about your homework for this episode. As any good teacher knows, I have to end the episode, just like a class period, by assigning you some homework. Maybe that's not best practice, actually. But anyhow, your homework for this episode, as Chris and I decided during the interview, is to find an educator you know who loves a Philly cheesesteak and tell them about the Educational Duct Tape Podcast and the Education Podcast Network and Podcast PD and House of EdTech and all of Chris's podcasts and other ventures so that they know that these guys who like a good Philly cheesesteak also host really awesome podcasts and they could tune in to listen to them. So that does it for today's episode. If you enjoyed what you heard, please tell a friend, tell a colleague that's more of an acquaintance than a friend, tell an enemy, or share about it with the hashtag EDUDuctTape on social media. And if you really liked it, please consider rating the show on Apple Podcasts. Check the show notes for details about signing up for my newsletter, joining the Duct Tapers Facebook group, inquiring about having me work with you or your team of educators, getting some podcast stickers, and more. Thanks for all that you do as a listener, as a lifelong learner, and as an educator. Have a great day, and I will see you in a fortnight or so.
Thank you for listening to the Educational Duct Tape Podcast. Please visit eduducttape.com to join the discussion, share possible topics, inquire about being a guest, or contact Jake. And remember, duct is spelled with a T, not a quack quack K.
Hey, Educational Duct Tape and EdTech Integration Mindset readers. You are a reader of the book, aren't you? I hope you are. If you are, I've got a little quiz for you. Did you laugh at least once while reading the book? Did you feel more equipped to integrate technology after reading it? Did you learn some stuff? Will that experience benefit your students? Do you want to see your colleagues grow as EdTech integrators too? Do you want to see their students' experience improve? Do you want some free educational duct tape swag? Will you do me a favor? Well, if you answered yes to all of those questions, follow this simple 2-step process. Review the book on Amazon or Goodreads or another book reviews platform, and then head to eduducttape.com/review swag to claim your free swag bundle, and I'll drop it in the mail to you. Thanks for your support.